Well, what motivated the Soviet decision to seek Castro's agreement with the deployment of Soviet missiles on Cuban soil is a complex question. Under both Lenin and Stalin, it had always been clearly understood that the defence of the Soviet Union and the advance of the world revolution were indissolubly linked. It would have been unthinkable for Moscow not to have extended fraternal support to a tiny socialist country under threat of subversion and invasion by a giant imperialist neighbour. And it certainly is the case that the sharp threats against Cuba were part of a much wider strategic struggle against the whole socialist camp, with the West constantly seeking to get enough of a competitive edge in the arms race to deter communist progress. In addition to its home-based nuclear arsenal, in 1958 Washington had already deployed Thor IRBMs in Britain, and the deployment in 1961 of Jupiter IRBMs to Italy and Turkey further increased the threat to Moscow. And Moscow, by contrast, whilst able to target the US allies, couldn't get beyond Alaska on United States soil at that early stage. So the strategic advantage of missiles on Cuban soil, 99 miles from Miami, was self-evident. On the face of it, there was nothing obvious in Khrushchev's decision which did not accord with Bolshevik practice. The defence of Cuba and the defence of the Soviet Union were two sides of the same coin. So on one level, this is basically a story about the Soviet Union correctly giving internationalist support to a fellow socialist country under attack, and nothing unusual and everything to be applauded. However, there's another side to this story. As the dismal performance of Khrushchev as the crisis unfolded revealed just how much of a danger to socialist interests revisionism was proving to be. As Mao was to express it, under Khrushchev's leadership, the CPSU proceeded, quote, from adventurism to capitulationism. And we'll see how that came to be. Early in 1962, a group of Soviet military and missile construction engineers met with Fidel Castro, and Castro welcomed the prospect of nuclear defences on Cuban soil. In July, Khrushchev met with Raúl Castro, and a secret agreement was signed. In the late summer, Soviet engineers began work on a number of missile sites under the pretense of being irrigation and agricultural experts. Marshal Sergei Beryuzov, head of the Soviet rocket forces, returned from a field trip to Cuba to tell Khrushchev that the missiles would be hidden under palm trees. On the 8th of September, the first tranche of R-12 missiles arrived, and then came the second on the 16th of September. Nine sites were under construction. So, given the heavy surveillance by imperialist espionage agencies and frequent violation of Cuban airspace by U-2 spy planes, it was surely predictable that the deployment would soon enough be rumbled. On the 14th of October, a U-2 took photos revealing missile sites being built, and Kennedy then ordered a blockade on Soviet shipping to put a halt to the transfer of missiles and warheads. This blockade was rebranded as a quarantine in an effort to skirt international law, playing with words. Khrushchev responded on 24th of October with a letter stating that the blockade constituted an act of aggression propelling humankind into the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. On the same day, he followed this up with what reads almost like an apologetic telegram, remonstrating with Kennedy that, quote, if you coolly weigh up the situation which has developed, not giving way to passions, you will understand that the Soviet Union cannot fail to reject the arbitrary demands of the United States. Meanwhile, the tension ratcheted up as the US Navy received orders to open fire on Soviet ships that tried to break the blockade. On the 26th of October, Washington upped the readiness level of Strategic Air Command, or SAC, forces to something called DEFCON 2. I don't know what DEFCON 2 stands for exactly, but effectively it means it's the last bit before you get to defence condition, is it? Okay. It's effectively, it's the final stage before outright nuclear war. 23 nuclear-armed B-52s were sent to orbit points within reach of the Soviet Union. Some 80% of SAC planes were ready for launch. Yet, according to a source quoted by Wikipedia, General David Backchannel, He said the Russians were so thoroughly stood down, and we knew it. They didn't make any move. They did not increase their alert. They did not increase any flights or their air defence posture. They didn't do a thing. They froze in place. Perhaps this picture of military paralysis, if it is to be credited, is evidence that Khrushchev was allowing his revisionist illusions in permanent peaceful coexistence to colour his judgment at this crucial juncture. Having invited Cuba to put its very existence on the line in the name of socialist solidarity, having raised the stakes so high by going head-to-head with Kennedy on the issue, it was the Soviet leaders' clear duty to see that struggle through. Weakness at such a moment was infinitely more dangerous than standing firm. Yet it seems that Khrushchev preferred to place all his reliance on trying to cobble together a get-out deal via back-channel communications. The KGB stations chief in Washington, a man called Alexander Felixov, who was also known as Fomin, an alias, he contacted a journalist on the ABC News called John Scally to ask him to sound out his State Department contacts to see if they would do a deal. The Soviet Union would pull out the missiles out of Cuba if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. That was going to be the deal. 5 hours after these two men met, a long letter started coming through the wire from the Soviet Union. It was a personal plea from Khrushchev to Kennedy, offering the same capitulationist deal, a deal that depended entirely on Kennedy's word of honour not to invade. The letter said, I propose, this is a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy, I propose, we for our part will declare that our ships bound for Cuba are not carrying any armaments. You will declare that the United States will not invade Cuba with its troops and will not support any other forces which might intend to invade Cuba. Then the necessity of the presence of our military specialists in Cuba will disappear. Elsewhere in the letter, Khrushchev tries to coax imperialism over to the virtuous path of peaceful coexistence, and in the process merely tying himself up in knots and presenting Kennedy with an open goal. He pleads, Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied, and a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it, and then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly of what terrible forces our countries dispose. Consequently, if there is no intention to tighten that knot, and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let's take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this. The next day, 27th of October, Khrushchev abruptly changed his tune again, this time having his new, tougher message broadcast publicly on Radio Moscow. The message ran like this. You are disturbed over Cuba. You say that this disturbs you because it's 99 miles by sea from the coast of the United States of America. But you have placed destructive missiles, which you call offensive, in Italy and Turkey, literally next to us. I therefore make this proposal. We are willing to remove from Cuba the means to which you regard as offensive. Your representatives will make a declaration to the effect that the United States will remove its analogous means from Turkey, and after that, persons entrusted by the UN Security Council could inspect the fulfillment of the pledges made. Now, this proposed deal, as opposed to the one on the previous day, seemed a bit more concrete. It was demanding the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Italy and from Turkey. But Kennedy chose simply to ignore the tougher sounding new proposal, instead responding to the earlier capitulation. The only improvement was to be an unwritten understanding that the missiles in Turkey and Italy would voluntarily be removed after some unspecified period had elapsed. So what you've got is a picture here of Khrushchev chopping and changing. One day offering a capitulationist message, the next day offering a deal which actually required imperialism to take a step back. And Kennedy simply says, "Well, we don't like the second one too much, but we'll go with the first one." The letter back from Kennedy oozes cynical condescension, reflecting the propaganda humiliation to which Khrushchev's prevarications had needlessly exposed the Soviet Union. He says, "As I read your letter," I won't try and do an American accent, "the key elements of your proposals, which seem generally acceptable as I understand them, are as follows. Number one, you will agree to remove these weapons systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observation and supervision, and undertake with suitable safeguards to halt the further introduction of such weapons systems into Cuba. Number two, we on our part would agree, upon the establishment of adequate arrangements through the United Nations, to ensure the carrying out and continuation of these commitments. A, to remove promptly the quarantine measures now in effect, and B, to give assurances against the invasion of Cuba." Khrushchev's response, broadcast on Radio Moscow on the 28th of October, was craven in the extreme, stating that, quote, "The Soviet government, in addition to previously issued instructions on the cessation of further work at the building sites for the weapons, has issued a new order on the dismantling of the weapons which you described as offensive and their crating and return to the Soviet Union." The 42 missiles were duly loaded onto 8 Soviet ships. The ships had to run the gauntlet of United States observers, with their hatches left open so those US observers could make sure that the missiles were really going. Needless to say, US imperialism was cock-a-hoop at this outcome, recognising it as a splendid propaganda victory which revisionist confusion had handed to it on a plate. As for Washington's pledge to respect the inviolability of Cuban borders, its sovereignty, its pledge not to interfere in internal affairs, we need only ask the Miami Five how faithfully this pledge has been observed ever since. As it turned out, Washington did decide to get rid of the near-obsolete Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy the following year, and you could argue, some people would argue, that this gave Khrushchev's diplomacy a sort of theoretical victory on points. However, this did nothing in practice to diminish the damaging effects of Khrushchev's vacillation and public retreat. We can only imagine the shame and the disgust of the Soviet engineers, who had surely seen it as their internationalist duty to go to Cuba and help defend socialism, when they were then ordered to dismantle their handiwork, crate it all back up, send it back to Russia under the baleful gaze of Yankee pirates. The Soviet Union and the Cuba deserve better than Khrushchev. It's possible that part of Khrushchev's motivation for embarking so light-mindedly on such a serious course of action was to give the lie to Chinese criticisms of revisionist passivity in the face of imperialist aggression, notably the refusal to assist China in developing her nuclear capability. In point of fact, however, the humiliation and dangers to which this zigzagging revisionist leadership exposed the socialist camp only served to confirm the Chinese comrades' worst fears. The October crisis happened at a moment when fraternal relations between socialist China and the Soviet Union were reaching breaking point, and Mao's Marxist-Leninist characterization of Khrushchev's handling of the crisis as moving from adventurism to capitulationism really hits the nail on the head.